Hello, Professor Noller. So I would definitely say that this podcast challenged me emotionally, especially when they started talking about, the raid on the Capitol. I think that was something that was very emotional for a lot of people, not really expecting something like that to ever happen, especially in my lifetime. And just seeing, the disrespect. I know it definitely affected a lot of people, and it's a big, major talking point that a lot of people are talking about right now. So that definitely, kind of was emotional. Another thing that was kind of emotional for me was the mask refusal in Congress, which led to an outbreak of coronavirus in Congress. These people are our lawmakers, the people that are supposed to be setting examples. So I can't really process how it's a political issue to wear a mask when it's going to save lives. That emotionally, that doesn't really, or even socially, that doesn't really process in my brain where if it can protect you, it can protect others. Why won't you do it? Why are you leaving it up to a political issue when it's not a political issue? It's a health issue. It's a human decency issue. So that, kind of emotionally made me kind of angry. And then more with the policy on vaccinations. It's emotional. Who gets it first? Especially for the older people who want it, setting up appointments. They talked about it in the last podcast we watched last week, like the old people waiting outside in line. And it's emotionally frustrating for, to have this thing ready for people and it's not available. There's so much disarray in how they're setting up the whole vaccination program that people who really want it and need it aren't getting it. And so that is very frustrating. And then when they talked about the mental health in the US, which is something that I've discussed in many classes with my teachers and everyone, everyone's going through isolation, anxiety, the substance use, the opioid crisis, and, child abuse. All these things are going on, and mental health has been kind of on the back burner this entire, because COVID's been on the front, you have to discuss COVID-19. And so mental health, everyone's just, in a place right now where they have been affected some way mentally by this. There's no way that there's, people who haven't been affected at least a little bit. And I think that's very emotional. So some of the topics did catch my attention, sorry. When they talked about the cutting off of money to between big businesses and Republicans, because they don't want to be seen as, part of the Republican or like funding the Republicans, and like how they may change legislation based on this. If they're not supporting Republicans, is legislation going to change? That kind of caught my attention. And then another thing that caught my attention was how masks now have to be worn on federal property. And, if you don't wear it, you will be fined. And that caught my attention because, I agree that like it should be up to the people's decision. But when people are repeatedly making the wrong decision, there has to be some sort of federal mandate for these masks, because we all want the vaccine to work and we want to go back to, the old normal, not this new normal. But if people aren't wearing masks, they're not slowing the curve. How are we ever going to get back to a place where we can feel comfortable going outside without a mask? And so I do agree with the federal legislation of masks on federal property. And it's not, I think a fine might be too small of a punishment for these people, because I don't really see a fine as really changing their ways or making them want to wear a mask. So that kind of caught my attention. And then also the continuance of the vaccine rollout, how it's still bad. I feel like that's catching a lot of people's attention. And how they talked about getting vaccines to people and not people to vaccines. I think that that's a very fundamental issue that the government is going through right now, because, as they talked about in the podcast, if someone has to take 3 buses to get to a vaccine and then 3 buses home, the likelihood of that person doing that is very small. So we need to get the vaccines to where the people are and not have to make people travel to the vaccines. This video didn't really have any conflicts with any of my beliefs. If I had to say anything, about like the hospital billing story they told about the lady who went in with some abdominal pain and she got sent a crazy high bill. It didn't really conflict with any of my beliefs, but I like I said last week, I'm a firm believer that people should know what they're paying for. And this woman was, just kind of hit with a big bill and she didn't really know what it was for. And I don't agree with that. And I think that, hospitals should be held responsible for disclosing their prices to people. And they didn't really say anything against thinking that that was a good or bad idea. But it just was kind of one of the beliefs that I had that they talked about. So some questions I were left with was, I'm just kind of confused about the political reasons for not wearing a mask. I don't see how it comes down to a party issue. It's a health issue. So I really am confused with Republicans not wanting to wear masks versus Democrats wearing masks. I don't see how it's a party issue. I understand that there are people in both parties not wearing masks, but it shouldn't be down to the party. It should be down to public health. If you want people to be healthy, then you do what's best for people. There's no smoking inside restaurants anymore because secondhand smoke is so dangerous. So why can't these people be more, open to seeing that it's not about a party, it's about the health of the public. Another question I had was about the block grant for Tennessee for the Medicaid program. That was kind of confusing for me just because I don't really know what block grants are. They did it pretty well explaining it as, like they'd get limited money with fewer strings attached and then they'd get to keep 50% of all the savings it just kind of like went over my head. I don't really see how it's a huge deal, but I'm going to do some research and try to, understand it a little bit better. And then relating to some past experiences or readings, like the vaccine administration, seems like all I've been reading about and talking about in other classes, the demand for the vaccine in people over 65. And it does kind of seem like there's a switch between people, being afraid of the vaccine and now being more accepting of the vaccine, which I think is good. And then, talking about areas where the vaccine is in high demand and areas of very low demand. We've been talking about that a lot in classes. And also how there's still no mass media campaign for vaccine, which I've talked about in other classes. There's no social outreach for telling people about the vaccine, the pros, everything that it's going to do, what the vaccine aims to, create in the future where we don't have to wear masks, where we maybe don't have to social distance as much, and we can have some immunity. So overall, I really did enjoy this week's podcast. I learned some new things, and I'm excited for next week's.